Hello, everybody. Welcome to Central Park. My name is Ryan, and thank you so much for joining us today. We're very happy to continue bringing the park to you because we know even though the weather is getting nicer, it can still be pretty difficult to get to New York and to Central Park. So we're going to bring the park to you through, of course, our in-person programming, as well as our virtual programming, like our longer 45-minute virtual programs and our shorter, more informal, about 15-minute weekly walks. Thank you for joining us today on May 18th, 2022 for a weekly walk featuring a cherry bloom walk. Just in case anybody hasn't had the opportunity to see some of the cherry blossoms, which were a little short-lived and early blooming this year, or sometimes late blooming, depending the species, we did want to offer you the opportunity to get to vicariously live through some of the photos we took here in Central Park and get to witness some of these amazing historic cherry blossoms. Because of course, there's so many beautiful blooms to see in the spring season, but cherry blossoms have become an epitome for us to view. And we'll talk a little bit about how cherry blossoms became such a tradition in America on our little weekly walk today. So thank you again for joining us as we celebrate Central Park. We're going to be together for about 15 to 20 minutes as we make our way through the park, seeing photos that were taken in Central Park over the past about 2 weeks. And of course, have a fun little enjoyable educational walk. As always, thank you so much for joining us and for supporting us at the Central Park Conservancy. As many of you may be familiar, we're the nonprofit private organization that since 1980 has been caring for Central Park. Our mission being to preserve and celebrate Central Park as a sanctuary from the pace and pressures of city life, enhancing the enjoyment and well-being of all. And that's something we couldn't do without the help from individuals like yourselves. So thank you so much for joining us and for supporting us in keeping the park looking clean and green. On our program today, we're using Zoom, which I'm sure you're familiar with as well. If you do want to say hello, please use the chat feature. Maybe let us know where you're joining us from. If you have a question, please use the Q&A feature. I actually don't have any colleagues on the back end today, but I will be able to jump on throughout the tour today, hopefully answer some questions, but if not, I will come in at the end of our walk and I'll answer any questions that you might have. Last thing you'll see pop up are some visitor polls. I'll launch 1 or 2 throughout the walk today and share the results once everybody has voted. Lastly, you will see we are using live transcripts. You do have the opportunity to turn those off by going to your Zoom bar, which is either located on the bottom or the top of the screen. And you can see a circle on the far right of that picture, which shows the live transcript feature, the way in which you can disable that function. As we do make our way through the park again, we're going to be exploring some of the beautiful cherry blossoms, but also feature some of the other amazing history and feature that exist in this area. And of course, we're going to be walking around the Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis Reservoir, a very amazing engineering feat, which we'll talk a little bit about. We're going to begin our walk over on Central Park West or 8th Avenue, beginning at around 93rd Street as we enter the park near Tarcoin Wild West Playground, one of 21 playgrounds found throughout the park. As we enter the park, we luckily have a bright, sunny day, blue skies. We're finally getting what really feels like spring weather. For a moment there, it almost felt like we skipped over spring and went right into summer as we were getting some very hot days, but a perfect day as we're walking around today. Perfect temperatures, not too hot, not too cold. And of course, beautiful trees that we get to see with some of the buds starting to become apparent. This group of trees here is one I have to point out. It's a nice little strand of elm trees that is grouped together. I'm not sure how many elm trees are growing here, but it's amazing to see how exposed their roots are. And it offers us the example that most mature trees in the park, their roots only extend about 18 inches below the surface of the ground. We can see, of course, not a lot of cover for these trees to hold on to, which is one of the reasons it's really important we avoid walking too much on trees' roots or climbing trees, because with millions of visits to the park, all of our steps do add up, and it's important to reduce soil compaction and make sure these trees survive. We will eventually put things like maybe more topsoil and wood chips on top of these to add a little bit of extra layering and resistance for these trees, but something amazing to admire as we make our way through the park. And as we cross the West Side Drive, we'll walk a little bit farther into the park, getting away from the hustling and bustling 8th Avenue. And as we make our way further down, again, getting to enjoy the blue skies, some of the trees which haven't started leaving out just yet, but some that have already made their way into more of a summer type of look. As we come a little bit further down the park, we'll of course see a lot of recreation in this area because there's various forms of recreation, such as the Central Park tennis courts. We'll see about 26 clay courts over here, as well as four hard courts. These courts would originally come in a little bit different of a form. Originally, tennis being played on the grassy meadows, but eventually getting an upgrade during the early 1900s when permanent courts would be added in. We'd see about 26 clay courts initially being added, with that material eventually being changed over time to a material called hard true. Hard true, also being known as quick dry, dries a little bit quicker in the rain, holds a lesser temperature, and actually provides a little bit more safer and softer of a material for people to play tennis on. Beyond that, though, we also do see 4 hard courts located in the back. Hard courts are primarily what we see tennis being played on in the US Open. But those courts today can be used for a lot of the youth groups that are just getting into the sport of tennis and learning really the wonders of this amazing activity. And one that we can play here in Central Park. These courts actually add up to the largest set of public tennis courts in all of New York City. And of course, as you make your way around the tennis building, around the tennis courts rather, you will find a tennis building, which would be the first building to be added in the 20th century, and one that offers you an opportunity to use the lockers or get a bite to eat before you play. As we make our way closer to the reservoir, we'll come to another form of recreation that exists in the area. But first, we can cross over one of the 3 cast iron bridges to exist around this area. This is probably my favorite cast iron bridge in the park. This is bridge number 28, otherwise known as the Gothic Bridge, getting that nickname from its very Gothic inspired architecture. And walking up top, we can notice some of the beautiful cast iron balustrades, which have more of a 4-leaf clover type of pattern on them, like a quatrefoil. These quatrefoils add just such a beautiful little frame to the surrounding reservoir, which we can see through this balustrade and railway. I love these views where we get the park's architecture framing the naturalistic beauty, which we can walk across bridge number 28 and see firsthand. As we make our way closer to the reservoir, this is where we're primarily going to be walking along on our walk today, around this 1 billion gallon source of water, which would be completed during the park's construction around 1862. It offers us a beautiful little walkway for our walk as we start making our way around the west side of this 1 billion gallon reservoir. As we walk along, we do have to watch out because we are walking on another recreation area in the park. The pathway that surrounds this reservoir is a 1.58-mile running track. So we do have this running track actually serving as a one-way path. As you do come around the reservoir, please try to keep in the one-way pathway that follows a counterclockwise pattern around the reservoir, allowing us safe travel so we don't have to worry about running into somebody that's using this space for recreation. But of course, as we leisurely walk along the area, we can hang along the railing, enjoy some of the beautiful views of this expansive source of water, as well as the home it provides to countless different forms of wildlife. And as we peer over the edge where we come up along the running track, we can see some wildlife I'm sure we're all familiar with, Canada goose. Canada goose come into the park and they tend to nest down here in this lower United States portion of North America. Sometimes being friendly, sometimes being not so friendly, but adding a little bit of fun and whimsy to different areas of the park as they set up their nests very close by to some of our walkways, like in this example here. These Canada geese are pretty fun too, because what I like about them, they're very much like us, where they're on kind of different schedules. While most of them are mating around this general season, the timing is kind of left up to them. Some are just starting their nests now, some are just starting to lay eggs, some have already had their goslings and they're already practically teenagers at this point. So we see a lot of these geese operating on a little bit different of a schedule, much like ourselves. As we continue walking down the path, we'll let that goose get a little bit of privacy and we'll walk under some of the beautiful cherry blossoms we have sprinkled along this way. Of course, there's so many different varieties and colors that come from these cherry blossoms. There's never a bad sight or color to view. And as we continue walking along the western edge of the reservoir, we're going to encounter many more. So we'll save our cherry blossom talk for just a little bit, and we'll wait till we're fully immersed by cherry blossom trees down one of the cherry blossom alleys. But as we continue making our way down the path, we can eventually start to branch off from the reservoir path and this running track, and instead walk on a little bit more spacious of the path, just parallel to the path we're currently on. So as we bear right, we can begin walking on the Bridle Path. Now, some of you who are a bit familiar with Central Park's history, or those who've been paying attention on many of our weekly walks, probably know what the Bridle Path was used for. And as we make our way down, we can see the El Dorado, a little bit covered partially by a tree here. Just beyond this exit of the park, we would find the 90th Street Arch, which is otherwise known as the Claremont Arch. It would get its name from the Claremont Riding Academy, which used to exist just near the entrance or exit of the park. This academy, unfortunately, would close in 2007, but prior to that, it would be the premier horseback riding rental agency for people to come into the park and utilize the Bridle Path, a path meant for horseback riding. Unfortunately, since that academy closed in 2007, we're not seeing many horses in the park, but we can still see reminders of horses like these stepping stones you may notice along the Bridle Path area, especially along the west side where we can find a few within a short distance. These stepping stones, size comparison provided by my colleague Jose, give you a little bit easier of a way to mount a horse. We unfortunately, again, don't see too many horses coming back into the park and horseback riding being done as much as it used to be. However, just the other day when we were doing this walk around, I was able to find some horses that were entering the park right near Claremont Arch. I didn't have time to ask where they're coming from or if it's going to be a more regular thing, but hopefully we'll see horses returning to the park and maybe more accessible horseback riding offered to the public. So fingers crossed we see this revival of a traditional activity. But come find these stepping stones located throughout the reservoir path, the Bridle Path rather, that surrounds the reservoir. As we continue walking down along that 90th Street entrance or exit area, we'll make our way now through the beautiful cherry blossoms and some of the beautiful cherry blossom alleys. While we make our way down here, I do want to launch a first simple poll, which is related to the horseback riding. I believe I've asked something similar to this before, but I just want to check again. Has anybody ever been horseback riding just in general? And second question, has anybody ever been horseback riding in Central Park? I myself have been horseback riding a few times, but never in Central Park. So that's something I still want to cross off my bucket list. But for now, I'll let everybody vote in that as we make our way down this beautiful off-path trail, one that is more of a dirt chip path that takes us through some of the immensely beautiful cherry blossoms. Now, cherry blossoms have become, again, an epitome for the spring season. I think it's the main thing we think of, even though there are countless other blooms to view. Of course, cherry blossoms entice us into the park, and arguably one of the best areas in all of New York to see cherry blossoms is along this western pass of the reservoir, because we have this more narrow path that just encapsulates us amongst these beautiful cherry blossoms. And of course, some areas help to create a nice shadowy patch that block out the hot sun, while others open a little bit more spacious and allow the sun to penetrate some of those nice pink petals, giving us a nice contrast of color. And as we walk down, we can thank really why cherry blossoms exist in the United States. Like many things, they're coming here and they're really existing because of two women. We see two women helping to really front run the arrival of cherry blossoms to the United States. The woman we can see on the left is Eliza Skidmore. She would be a philanthropist, a journalist, and a world traveler. And upon returning from her first visit to Japan in 1885, she wanted to bring cherry blossoms to Washington, D.C. She was immensely blown away by the beauty and proposed bringing cherry blossoms to D.C. Unfortunately, her proposal would fall on deaf ears for the next 24 years as she continued to try to get cherry blossoms brought to Washington, D.C. Eventually, around 1909, she said, "I'll just fund them myself," starting to fundraise the money to purchase cherry blossoms to bring them to Washington, D.C. She wrote a letter to Mrs. Helen Taft, First Lady, who we can see pictured on the right, who immediately agreed with this proposal. Mrs. Helen Taft, pictured on the right, having lived in Japan, knew of the cherry blossom's beauty and was very on board with bringing them to DC. She wrote a public letter 2 days later that was publicized, and it just so happens that two other gentlemen would help to continue this push for cherry blossoms. The day that Mrs. Taft's public letter was issued, we would see this man on the left, Dr. Jokichi Takamine, a chemist who would be most famous for discovering adrenaline, visiting Washington, D.C. with the Japanese consul from New York City. He saw Mrs. Taft's letter and said, "Would you be willing to accept a gift of 2,500 cherry blossom trees?" In which he would contact Mayor Yukio Ozaki, pictured on the right, who would give the gifts in honor of Tokyo. We would see about 2,500 cherry blossom trees being gifted to Washington, D.C., and a separate batch being gifted to New York City just a year prior in celebration of the Hudson Fulton Festival. But we see these trees being gifted really because of Eliza Skidmore, Mrs. Helen Taft, Dr. Jokichi Takamine, and Yukio Ozaki of Tokyo. Thanks to these four individuals, we see cherry blossoms arriving to New York City and to Washington, D.C., and beginning this annual festival, as well as this just cherry blossom craze that has been continuing for over the past 100 years. What's interesting to think about are the species that were given. Now, originally, the main species given were Yoshino cherry blossom trees, which we can see highlighted on the top. This image is coming from the National Park Survey and highlights the exact amount of species and trees given during the initial gifts. We can see primarily Yoshino trees gifted with 1,800, with the second largest number being a species called Kwanzan. Now, Yoshino cherry blossom trees are the more lighter pink white petals that typically are found along the east side of the Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis Reservoir, at least in the highest number. The trees we're going to see over on the west side of the reservoir, which we're currently viewing, are a little bit different of a species. These are Kwanzans, which have become the favored cherry blossom tree in modern day culture. These Kwanzan cherry blossom trees are heavily cultivated and hybridized today to have really bright pink petals and to have an excessive number of petals with upwards of 30 to 40 per flower, and a lot larger clusters of flowers rather than the more spacious Yoshino cherry blossoms. Although we see Yoshinos being the primary gift, today we'll see Kwanzans really drawing in the most crowds, as most botanical gardens in areas throughout New York and the United States in general feature these types of Kwanzan cherry trees primarily, more than the Yoshinos, which were the original gift. Again, today in Central Park, you can find primarily Yoshinos along the east side of the Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis Reservoir and primarily Kwanzans along the west side of the Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis Reservoir. As we continue down the path, we can come to the end of this wonderful little alley, which stretches for quite a good distance. I really am bad with estimating, and I didn't check the exact block ratio, but I believe for about a quarter mile or so of a nice cherry blossom stretch, you can walk down this path given the proper season and view these blooms. Now, unfortunately, these blooms are no longer in bloom. So we did want to provide you this because I know, again, cherry blossom viewing is very hard to predict and the blooms do not last so long. We want to give you as many opportunities to view these blooms, even if it's through a photo. As we make our way back onto the bridle path for just a moment, we can start to make our way back to the running track. But as we do, I wanted to just end that poll. And since we're back on the bridle path, share results. And this is what I kind of expected to see, but hopefully something we can change. So it looks like the majority of us have been horseback riding before, but just a whopping 5% have been horseback riding in Central Park. That's something we need to change. I think we need to get horses brought back to the park, and we need to all get our horseback riding experience in the park up a little bit. So that's something I hope to see coming. And again, the other day, I was lucky enough to see horseback riding returning to the park. Even if it was just for the day or the week, it's still a nice, refreshing surprise. As we continue making our way just down the park, we're going to start walking back onto that running track. Again, we're going to make sure we're walking counterclockwise, so we're going with the flow of traffic. And as we start to walk down along this reservoir, again, we can enjoy this massive, massive reservoir, which today has over 1 billion gallons of water in it. And on that note, I'd like to actually launch the second poll I have for you, which is going to be a little bit of a guessing game, maybe one that might be easy. It is, what is the largest reservoir? We have the Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, the New Croton Reservoir, and the Ashokan. And of course, there are plenty other different reservoirs in New York, but I just wanted to give 3 to make it a little bit easier. So as we walk along this reservoir, I'll let everybody vote in that. And we can also admire the beauty of this reservoir. One of the most beautiful parts of the reservoir is its focus on the expansive water rather than the architecture that surrounds it. The fence that we see here is a very minimal fence, one that's made of, originally made of a cast iron material, but today made of a little bit more of a composite type material that really replicates cast iron, but is a little bit more affordable and a little bit longer lasting without as much wear and tear. This fence is of course very beautiful, and it's based on an original design. But interestingly enough, this original fence was lost for quite some time. For a long while, we would see a very different style fence existing around the reservoir. This original design was one created by we're a partnership with Calvert Vaux and Frederick Law Olmsted, with Calvert Vaux designing some of the decorative features we see around. But unfortunately, over time, this was lost, and we would see a large, about 8-foot tall chain link fence surrounding the reservoir, really just ruining the beauty of this landscape. Luckily, we were able to replace this fence. And the reason we were able to replace it was during a restoration project of the reservoir. We were able to have some people actually go in and scuba dive in the reservoir. And during this time, they recovered a small section of a cast iron fence, one that originally surrounded the reservoir but was lost over time. We see that small section leading to a replica being created that today completely spans around the reservoir, bringing back that more expansive and beautiful view that was once lost. And it's really amazing to have this change. This is a fence that anybody that's ran around this running track back in the 80s and 90s probably remembers. If anybody's ever seen the movie, like I believe The Marathon Man with Dustin Hoffman, this is the fence you're going to see in that movie. Unfortunately, it wasn't replaced in time to have a little bit more beautiful of a backdrop, but it's this great reminder of how far Central Park has come. This fence largely being restored in the 2000s and getting this uglier chain fence taken away. Luckily today, again, an immaculate view, one where we don't have to worry about seeing over, as most people, even if you're a little shorter, can step on this little raised edge along the fence and get a beautiful view over or through the sides, allowing, again, just a lot of beauty to be withheld. As we come over and take a view throughout the reservoir, I do want to end and share that last poll, and that is, what is the largest reservoir? So we have the Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis Reservoir, which we're walking around today, which has about 1 billion gallons of water. The New Croton Reservoir would actually come a little bit after the as we know it today, the JKO Reservoir, which was originally named the New Reservoir. Croton Reservoir and the JKO Reservoir are a little bit similar in size, but there's one on this list that drastically blows out of the water, pun intended, the other 2 reservoirs, and that is the Ashokan Reservoir. The Ashokan Reservoir is about 8,300 acres, a lot more than Central Park in its entirety, which is only 843 acres. So while the JKO Reservoir holds 1 billion gallons of water, the Ashokan Reservoir holds just under 130 billion gallons of water. So the Ashokan Reservoir is going to be by far the largest reservoir out of these 3, and the largest one we'll have in New York, which supplies the majority of the water today. The reservoir, this one, the JKO Reservoir, has water supplied from the original Croton Aqueduct system, which today maybe accounts for at most 10% of New York City's water supply. So that 129.9 billion gallon Ashokan Reservoir is going to be the winner. And we can actually see a reminder and really an ode to the Ashokan right here in the JKO. This little fountain that we're overlooking is actually a fountain that was installed in 1917 to honor the opening of the first water tunnel and the completion of the Ashokan Reservoir in upstate New York. This fountain, much like the fence, was lost over time, as it originally would only be turned on for special events, but eventually would become so damaged it couldn't really even be turned on if people wanted it to. We were luckily able to restore this in the 2000s when we did a restoration of the Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis Reservoir, keeping it as a permanent fixture on the fountain, on the reservoir today. But a great reminder of the largest reservoir we have in New York, the Ashokan Reservoir. As we continue walking along the running track, we can also enjoy some of the wildlife that exists around here. Hopefully this video works, but I just wanted to show this fun little video we got to see of some of my favorite migratory birds stopping by the reservoir. These are bufflehead ducks. These little bufflehead ducks, we have a male on the left and a female on the right, are fun little diving ducks. And of course, watching the reservoir, you can see it going from filled with bird life to nothing as they dive under the water, leaving us behind, going to catch maybe some of the aquatic fish and other invertebrates and insects that live in here today. Today, the reservoir not supplying drinking water, but rather plenty of food and even a home for a lot of different wildlife, like these bufflehead ducks. All right. So we will continue on if I can figure out how to skip through. There we go. And as we come towards the end of our walk, we're approaching our last stop as we come along the reservoir, making our way to the South Pump House. This South Pump House working with the North Pump House to provide a different function. The North Pump House is controlling the flow of water into this reservoir. This South Pump House controlling the flow of water down into Lower Manhattan. And of course, always new features to find. I come by this area all the time, and for some reason, I feel like I never really noticed this beautiful clock that sits up top of the reservoir. Just a reminder that, again, there's constantly new things to see if you look left, right, up, down, and all around. You never know what you're going to find here in Central Park. And of course, this building created back between about 1862 to 1864 still looks as immaculate as it ever did. Thanks to, of course, the hard work of our Central Park Conservancy staff, keeping this building looking fresh. And as we look along the base of it, we can find some wonderful little illustrations that tell you a little bit more about the science behind this aqueduct system. Something really interesting to check out if you've never been to this area before. And as we come to the end of our walk, we can take one last view over one of the 3 cast iron bridges to exist over here, one that holds a little interesting of a secret. The last thing I wanted to show you was just this bridge number 24. Bridge number 24 is a pretty interesting one because of the cast iron bridges and of many bridges in the park. It's one of the only bridges, the only cast iron bridge as well, to have a flat top, but a curved archway. Now, I'm only going to show you the top of this, so you're going to have to come and see the profile of this arch for yourself. But a really interesting one that was restored by us, of course, over a few different restoration projects. Firstly, being restored back around 1979, when this was at one point just cemented over. Luckily, we were able to fix up the beautiful cast iron decoration and detail, as well as replace the original wood that existed up top, rather than that lesser attractive concrete. Thankfully, today, again, we have a lot of original aspects brought back to the park, like the original reservoir running fence, a lot of the beautiful original 1909 and 1912 gifted cherry blossoms, not the exact trees, but really the same species being preserved. And of course, a lot of other immaculate history being preserved, thanks to the hard work of our staff, our volunteers, and people like yourselves that, again, care for the park and help to contribute to our mission. I do want to thank you again for joining us as we enjoy this last view looking towards the South Pump House from bridge number 24, the only flat-topped cast iron bridge that we have in Central Park, and one of 5 remaining cast iron arches of the original 7. Thank you again for joining us on these walks, for supporting the park, and for taking an interest in Central Park. We really thank you for being stewards of the park, caring for it, making sure to stay on task, not pick flowers, throw your trash out, all the little things that go such a long way in caring for the park. As always, plenty of different programs coming up, from our regular core programs to special programs like this, the only tour that you will find in Central Park that is not led by our tour guides, the Conservatory Garden Tour, which is led by our garden staff. So if you ever wanted to learn exactly about the history of the garden and what that flower is, what that flower is, what that flower is, definitely take one of our Conservatory Garden Tours with our Conservatory Garden staff. Again, the most expert knowledge on any type of flora in the park. We certainly encourage you to check out these as well as plenty of the other tours we have. And of course, be sure to check on our website for different things like our bloom guide, our birding guide, and other ways to engage and connect with Central Park. As always, as we do come to the end of our walk, I do want to again thank you for joining us. I do want to let you know I am going to keep this open for a few minutes so I can answer any questions that we didn't have the opportunity to answer on our walk today. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us, for sticking around, and for hopefully learning a little bit about Central Park, this park that we absolutely love and that we couldn't keep alive without help from individuals like yourself. So thank you for joining us. And of course, we hope to see you real soon. From all of us here at the Central Park Conservancy, stay safe, be well, and we'll see you next week. Take care, everybody.